Hi everyone, Chris Schmidt with Key West Makers Channel. This video is about the making of this metal and maple console table, which was done as a birthday present for my son. He originally wanted a wall shelf that sat below his flat screen TV to hold a sound bar, gaming consoles, etc. And as a not so subtle message, I suggested making something that he could easily move with him when he moved out. He designed the long box concept, and we originally picked out some prefab metal legs on Etsy, but seeing an opportunity to buy a new tool, learn a new skill, I decided to fabricate the metal legs myself. The spot below his TV is a little over 4 feet long, and he wanted to take advantage of most of that space. So, armed with that info and a few sketches, I got to work on the project. I could have glued up individual maple boards to make up the top and sides, but my local hardware store, Strunk Ace Hardware here in Key West, sells maple project panels in various widths and lengths at a pretty reasonable price. One of the drawbacks to living here is that it's hard to get your hands on hardwoods other than mahogany. Since I have to learn to weld in order to make the legs for this project, I don't mind taking a few shortcuts on the woodworking. So I have already cut these pieces to size. These are 11 inches by 11 inches, and the side panels are 47 inches length, and they're also 11 inches wide. Now that I have the top, bottom, and side pieces cut to their final sizes, let's talk about how we're going to join them together. I considered dovetails, biscuits, Festool dominoes, which is a floating tenon system, angled cuts with a spline, on and on. In the end, I decided on a box joint or a finger joint for 3 reasons. 1, for strength, the amount of glue surface it offers. It should be able to handle any racking or torsion when the piece is in use. 2, I really think it's going to fit the aesthetics for what I want in the piece. Number 3, I have an unopened Keller jig sitting around the shop I would love to try out. I have the jig set up and clamped to my workpiece. There's a bearing on the router bit that will ride on the fingers of the jig and guide my cut. I've set the router depth based on the material thickness plus the thickness of the jig. So let's start cutting. I'm going to make a separate video about my experience setting up and using the Keller 1500 for making box joints. But a couple of things to note. Number 1, it comes with the bits to make dovetails, but not the bit to make box joints, so that's an additional purchase. Number 2, you need to make your own backing board to mount the template on, at least the version I purchased did. And number 3, you need to cut the 2 mating parts of the joint independently when working with 3/4 inch stock. They do make a more expensive version that has longer fingers on the template, and I believe it can handle routing both pieces at the same time. I have to say I'm quite happy with the finished result though. And it does make a bit of a mess. Time for glue up. We'll see how we did making the parts. I'm doing the glue up and clamp up outside the shop to save space in my very compact workshop. Of course, I'm using my souvenir cup from the 2007 MLB All-Star Game for holding glue. The glue is dried, the clamps are off, and now I'm just doing a little bit of cleanup along the edges, especially at the corners where the joints are, with a block plane. panel will fit into the back of the carcass, so I need to create a rabbet in the inside edge of the back. A router bit with a bearing guide will do the trick. I set the depth of cut equal to the thickness of the back panel material. To give the router a wider surface to sit on, I clamped a scrap of wood to the carcass. The bearing on the bit sits below the cutter and rides along the inside of the carcass. Notice that the bit leaves the corners a bit rounded. When I cut out the back, I'll round the corners to fit. And now a bit of sanding for the entire carcass, working my way from 80 grit up to 180 grit. I use this really tiny brush to apply the finish very carefully, making sure every grain and pore is filled in. It's very tedious work, but well worth it. I'm kidding. I use a rag and rub it in. I put on 4 coats of General Finishes Armor Seal, sanding between coats, but not after the final coat. And this is a polyurethane oil combination. Back in the shop, at the table saw, I cut the back panel to width. And then on my sliding miter saw, I cut it to the appropriate length. As I mentioned before, the router bit that I used on the back to make the rabbet is going to leave rounded corners, so I just need to round off the corners to fit that on the back panel. And now to make some holes in the back panel for cables to pass through, I'm using a Forstner bit, and in the opening shots you can certainly see those holes. They're quite visible, but in practice when this is in use, there's usually equipment or something else sitting on that shelf, and the angle that you usually see it at, you don't see those holes at all. With the back panel now made, I mounted it in the carcass, though I didn't show that on film. And now it's time to make the metal legs that it'll sit on or stand on. The steel came in a nice heavy-duty cardboard tube. It's actually a bit ridiculous how long it took me to get it open. Seriously, it's like 20 minutes. Yay! I cut all the square tube steel parts on Rage 3 miter saw with their optional metal cutting blade. And I have to say, I am really impressed with how well this thing works and how accurate it was. There weren't really any burrs on the metal after the cutting process, but I'm cleaning all the ends where they will be welded. I'm cleaning them up with a grinder just so I have a clean area to weld on. I've never welded before this, so after a lot of reading and watching videos on the internet, I made my first weld. I actually spent about an hour or so practicing. And after about an hour or so of practicing, I am now welding the actual legs. I'm using these magnets to hold the corners square. First I tack it in place on both sides and then go back and finish the welds. Still learning as I went along here, I managed to finish the 2 rectangular legs And then I ground down the welds with the angle grinder and cleaned up all the metal with a flap disc. Where the legs attach to the carcass, the legs will have metal plates that are welded to the legs. I cut the metal, again on the Evolution Rage 3 miter saw, measured for the holes, and drilled the mounting holes with a stepped bit. After I cleaned up the welding spots on the mounting plates, I first tack welded them in 4 spots to the legs, and then went back and finished in the full weld on both sides. I cleaned up those welds as well with the grinder, and then it was on to a little bit of painting. While the paint was drying on the legs, I pre-drilled holes for the back panel and screwed the back panel in. Notice how the rounded corners of the back panel fit into the rounded corners of the carcass. What do you know, the legs are dry already. Let's mount them up and wrap this project up. And there you have it, our metal and maple console table. Thank you for watching Key West Makers. Sure hope you enjoyed it.